Hello, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Today on Another View, we begin our 7th Race Let's Talk About It conversation, this time with an in-depth look at literary master and civil rights activist James Baldwin. Our guest today is filmmaker Karen Thorsen. Her documentary, The Price of the Ticket, tells the life story of Baldwin through his voice. Thorsen weaves together a masterful story of the life and times of the man who talks about what it's like to be Black, poor, gifted, and gay in a world that doesn't understand that all men are brothers. Race, let's talk about it. Next on Another View, so stay tuned.
Discussing today's topics from an African American perspective, this is Another View.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. For the past 2 years, Another View has held town hall conversations throughout Hampton Roads about race. We call the series Race, Let's Talk About It. We've covered topics from race and politics to privilege, power, and difference to the talk, conversations minority families have with their children about interacting with police. We have 2 Race, Let's Talk About It events scheduled. Next Saturday, November the 4th from 2:30 until 4, our town hall conversation will be on understanding Muslim Americans and their religion. It's called Waging Peace, Beyond Extremism to Our Muslim American Neighbors. Our partners are Virginia Wesleyan Center for the Study of Religious Freedom, the YWCA Southampton Roads, and the One Love Festival. It's free, it's open to everyone, so please visit whro.org/talkaboutrace to register. Now, tomorrow, this weekend, we hold our 7th Race Let's Talk About It with a screening of the film James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. It's tomorrow from 2 until 5 p.m. at the Fort Monroe Theater in Hampton. Following the documentary, we will hold a conversation with filmmakers Karen Thorsen and Douglas Dempsey, and as always, you, the audience, will ask the questions. Our partners in this event include the Sankofa Project, National Park Service, Fort Monroe Authority, and Hampton Roads Pride. It's not too late to register. Go to whro.org/talkaboutrace. And as always, we begin the conversation right here on Another View, and I'm so pleased to have as my guest filmmaker Karen Thorsen, her film, James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket. Hi, Karen. How are you?
Hey, Barbara. I am so happy to be here.
I know,
this
we
is
are
perfect.
so excited to have you. And I have watched the film. It's awesome. I mean, it is just incredible. And I learned so much. So I really hope that our audience will come out and be encouraged to come out and participate with us tomorrow afternoon. We'll have a good time. But I'm curious. First of all, you knew Baldwin. You were working with him. And this film was not the original film that you set out to do. So give us a little bit of the backstory.
Well, it was a privilege, first of all, to work with James Baldwin alive. It began because I was working with the Maysles brothers, who are famous cinema verite filmmakers. They were, I should say. And they had their theory is that they go out in the world, they practice it. They would go with a film crew, pick someone interesting, follow them around, and sure enough, there would be a story. By the end of a certain number of hours, something interesting was guaranteed to have happened. And so the idea of James Baldwin came up, and I had discovered him when I was in college and thought, oh, what a great individual. I always wanted to be a writer. I didn't know I'd be a filmmaker, but writing is part of that. And here was this incredible individual. The first book I read was nonfiction essays, Notes of a Native Son. And he stuck in my head. I went on to read other things of his. And then when this idea came up at the film company where I was working, cinema verite, who would be an interesting topic? Well, James Baldwin. So we looked him up. Turned out he was working on his next book. He was teaching. And this was in the mid-'80s. Wow. And so we started working on it. He, even back in the first essays that I read back in college, he had written about how much he loved 16-millimeter cameras. His dream, I mean, we didn't have iPhones back then, so his dream was to have a 16-millimeter camera. And he went on and he worked on a number of film scripts, including The Life of Malcolm Epps.
Yes,
which
because he was trying to turn that into a screenplay, right?
Right, he was. Yeah. He was on assignment. Eventually, Spike Lee credited him as the source for a lot of the film that was eventually made, the autobiography of Malcolm X. But in any case, Jimmy loved film. He wrote The Devil Finds Work. He's done his share of film criticism. He was fascinated by the medium, so working with him was a joy because the book he was working on, Remember This House, was going to be his memory of the civil rights movement, also the lives of his three very close friends during the movement, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And then as we talked, well, how could we make it come to life on camera? Well, we could go to his classes where he was teaching. We could follow him around the South and observe him observing history. But he said, you know what? The kids of those three friends of mine, the centerpiece of the book, they're now 20-something. And he wanted to interview those kids. Oh, wow. And so it was basically the daughter of Malcolm X, the son of Medgar Evers, the son of Martin Luther King. He had known them, literally bounced them on his knees when they were, when they were infants and toddlers. And now he wanted to ask him a central question, which is, was it worth it that your father was assassinated?
Wow. That was going to be the question he was going to ask. Was it worth it that your father was
That was the center spine of our film. It was all about the issue that we still care about today, which is progress. Mm-hmm. Where are we? Where were we then, and where are we now?
So what happened?
Well, the tragedy, of course, is he didn't tell me. He didn't even tell his immediate family members in the States. He was living in France, and he was diagnosed with cancer. Mm-hmm. And I heard he was ill, and actually called him on the phone because back there wasn't fax, there wasn't email. So a lot of our work was done when he came through New York City or mostly by telephone, occasional letters. And so I called him and said, well, I hear these rumors. And he said, he cut me off. He knew where I was going. He cut me off and said, don't worry, Karen, we'll be filming by the end of the year. I didn't know how right he was because he died on December 1st. And we were filming by the end of the year.
Because you start the film with his funeral.
Well, that people who come and see the film will see that is a major event. I wanted the world to see how important he was. This major funeral in the biggest cathedral we've got in America, St. John the Divine. And everybody turned out to celebrate him.
And what a tribute it was. But I won't give away the rest of the film, I promise. But so you knowing him, that we read about him and we read that he's a literary giant and he was a civil rights activist and all these types of words. But who was he to you on a personal level, Karen?
He's still on my shoulder. So I can tell you he was a mentor then. He's a mentor now. He was so and is so eloquent. I reread him all the time, and I constantly, this helps keep me honest. This helps keeps my view of humanity. It makes sense to me, what he had to say, and I constantly turn to him for reference. He's like a friend, but I can tell you, you call him a giant. The first time we met, my first reaction when he came into the restaurant where we set up a meeting, and I saw him, and I thought, he's tiny.
You get that impression.
He was diminutive. He was a small stature. Mm-hmm. But then he spotted me and figured out pretty fast which one in the room he was headed for. And his smile it just filled the room. Oh. And so he indeed is and was a giant.
So having had the experience of working with him, and we're going to listen to some of his words and talk about some of the things that he said about civil rights and about race relations and about being homosexual and all of that. But having worked with him, has your perspective about the coming together of the races, has it changed from where you were before you knew him?
I would quote a young woman who was in one of our audiences because we're taking this film. The film has been remastered and restored. It was originally filmed on 16 millimeter, and now it's this gorgeous HD version. I hope people get to see it because it really does look great. And it was restored with the help of the Ford Foundation and Martin Scorsese and various donors like Stan and Joanne Martyr. The film is telling a story of a man who sees potential for humanity, and the young woman in the audience said, can we call James Baldwin a futurist? And for me, a light went off because he was looking at our future. He was looking at where we can go. It's not yet where we are. It's where we
Absolutely.
can go.
As a matter of fact, he talks about that. Victor, can you prepare clip 6, please? I want to hear him talk a little bit about where he thinks we can go with humanity.
A day will come when you will trust you more than you do now. When you trust me more than you do now. We can trust each other. I do believe, I really do believe in the New Jerusalem. I really do believe that we can all become better than we are. I know we can. But the price is enormous, and people are not yet willing to pay it.
But the price is enormous, and people are not yet willing to pay it. This is 2017.
I know. That's
How
why he
true
wanted
do those
to.
words ring now?
That's why he wanted to ask those kids, was it worth it that they lost their own father? Had we made enough progress? How can you ever say to a child that it's worth it that your father was assassinated? But in any case, it was about 2017. It's about...
I know, because think about it. He passed in 1987.
Yes,
correct?
December 1st, 1987.
And this is 2017. And he could have said this yesterday and still...
It's amazing when we bring this to high school kids and they listen to him and they feel as if he's talking today and they say, this guy lived when? In what century? They're just figuring it out.
Exactly.
But he wrote at the beginning his wonderful best-selling essay, The Fire Next Time, from 1963. It's 2 essays, and in the first essay he wrote about the anniversary of the Emancipation Declaration, and he said, we're celebrating it 100 years too soon. This was back in 1963. Wow. So he was giving us, we're 50 years in. We have another 50 years to go.
Wow. That says a lot right there. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Have you read James Baldwin? Do you know who he is and what he stood for? 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Okay, so for people who may not be as familiar with Mr. Baldwin, tell us about his childhood. Who was he?
Oh, my. Well, he grew up in Harlem. He was born in Harlem Hospital to a single mother. She was from Maryland, not so far away. She never told young Jimmy who his real father was. Rumor has it that he may have been a poet, that he may have died in prison. There's a lot of rumors, nothing confirmed. In any case, she came to Harlem with pregnant, had Jimmy in Harlem Hospital, eventually met a gentleman, Reverend Baldwin, who married her and adopted Jimmy, and he took on the name of Baldwin. But that was his stepfather, and it was a difficult relationship, to say the least. However,
his stepfather was very religious and very strict.
Very, very rigid, and just is it because Jimmy was an adopted son? Because who knows why? Actually, the gentleman, the Reverend, died in a mental institution. So he had issues that were growing, demons that were hard on him. But in any case, what I admire about Jimmy is that he was able to call this man, he intentionally called him his father throughout most of his writing in his life, because he had 8 siblings. There were 9 kids. Jimmy was the oldest, and he raised them, really, because the father was either out in the church or just not
One thing that he said that I remember from the film, Jimmy said, I see you have me calling him Jimmy.
Well, yeah, look, it took me a while to get past that hump. Mr. Baldwin to Jimmy is a leap, but he actually is Jimmy.
Oh, wow. Well, he says in the film, he talks about how his father could not be bent. He could only be broken. And I just went, I mean, when you think about that, and it kind of encapsulates the kind of relationship.
And who could say it more eloquently than that? That really does sum it up. And it pained him enormously. I think he actually says at some point he was hoping to make his father, meaning his stepfather, proud of him when he became a writer. And of course, his stepfather said, "You'll never succeed as a writer." And
Jimmy actually became a preacher.
Well, he did. Well, that was his stepfather's insistence, and he was raised in a very religious situation. From age 14 to 17, he was a boy preacher. But he credits that for helping him become a writer, because of the You have to write a sermon. You have to be eloquent. You have to know your scriptures. You read great literature to give a sermon. And it turned him into a writer.
Absolutely. And he also spent time and time, like he said, he went to the New York Library and read every book.
He did. This is the Schomburg Library up on 125th
Wow.
Street. I mean, he did read every book in that library, and that was really an important formative moment because he read Dostoevsky, he read Henry James, he read Dickens, he read about suffering, and he didn't put a color on it. He didn't say this is a black person suffering or a white person suffering. What he found as a kid reading these extraordinary tales where a human being was suffering. And he later said, I was never able to separate race into black and white because I understood that this was humanity.
And he looked at it across the board. Victor, I want to play the clip where he talks about clip 3, I believe. Or did we just play that one? Okay, clip 3 where he talks about being a writer.
Now, when you were starting out as a writer, you were black, impoverished, homosexual. You must have said to yourself, gee, how disadvantaged can I get?
Oh, no, I thought I hit the jackpot.
Oh, great.
It was so outrageous you could not go any further, you know. So you had to find a way to use it.
He had a sense of humor about it, even though, and he freely admits that he was homosexual.
Yes.
And back in the 60s, that was a huge admission.
He wrote a book, Giovanni's Room. The publishers who had published Go Tell It on the Mountain here in America were scared of that book, wouldn't touch it. It got published in Great Britain first, and it went on to sell very well. And there's been a play made of it, but nobody was talking about that. James Baldwin was really one of the first, and it was one of the first films on ever made that was on PBS.
So, what do you think that Baldwin would think today about same-sex marriage and all the progress that has been made in the gay community?
He'd be thrilled. I mean, he said, say yes to life. He didn't say yes to gay life. He said, say yes to life. He said, love comes in strange packages. You're lucky if you find it. You don't know where you're going to find it. I mean, it tortured him when he was a young man and was confused about his own sexual orientation. But he made peace with that. He found a way to cope. And he just decided love was that came from his mother. Love was the most important thing out there.
Was it easier for him when he was living overseas in terms of his sexuality or when he was here in America? What do you think?
I bet he'd make some pretty strange faces and say it wasn't easy anywhere in a lot of ways. But I think in general he found greater freedom overseas. I mean, you can't say he found freedom by going to Turkey, of all places, as a gay individual. And yet he did. He found a community, but his community was always broader than any one particular category. I think that's what saved him. He saw people through humanitarian eyes.
Absolutely. 440-2665 or 1-800-940-2240. Jennifer joins us from Hampton. Hi, Jennifer. You're on the air.
Thank you for taking my call.
Uh-huh.
And thank you for discussing James Baldwin. He's one of my favorite authors. My favorite book from him, there are 4.
Okay.
Beale Street Could Talk, Giovanni's Room, Notes of a Native Son, and The Fire Next Time.
Oh, you give me goosebumps.
I will be attending the
screening tomorrow?
movie. Yes.
Oh,
yes,
great.
Yes, I will be there.
Well, we look forward to seeing you there
Excellent.
tomorrow.
Can I just mention about If Beale Street Could Talk?
Sure, absolutely.
The wonderful filmmaker Barry Jenkins, who just won an Academy Award for Moonlight, one of his next projects is If Beale Street Could Talk.
Oh, see, it's coming to the big screen, Jennifer. That is fantastic. Thanks so much for the call. We appreciate it. So, Baldwin talks about, with one of the clips I want to get ready to play now, and that is, well, first of all, let me back up since she brought up Beale Street. Because by the time that book came out, there was a lot of talk about, from the critics, that Baldwin had become bitter. That he'd become, not as prolific a writer anymore, and things weren't. They weren't nice to him. I want to say, but I want to play this clip first. Clip 4, Victor, about this is his brother and Maya Angelou. So I put both of those together, talking about this question of bitterness.
People say Jimmy grew bitter. Put it this way to you. You cannot go to a page and describe a human being in love or a human being's pain if you're bitter.
Bitterness is like cancer. It eats upon the host. Jimmy was not bitter. What Jimmy was angry. He was constant. He was angry at injustice, at ignorance, at exploitation, at stupidity, at vulgarity. Yes, he was angry.
I don't think a lot of people realize just how involved he was with the civil rights movement.
Oh, well, he was overseas, and then it was when Dorothy Counts was spit on by the mob when she was trying to go to a formerly segregated high school for the first time. Mm-hmm. This young girl was so... Her picture was on the front pages of paper. He actually saw that on a newspaper in Paris. And he said he couldn't stay outside of the country anymore. He had to come home. And he got very involved. He became kind of a spokesperson. There was Malcolm, there was Martin, and there was Jimmy. And the three of them were like a triumvirate. He went all over the South. He obviously wrote about it. But he also became, and this comes from his time as a boy preacher, he became a secular preacher. He left the church in order to preach the gospel. And it's the gospel of freedom, equality, liberty.
Absolutely. And one of the things that he really honed in on was this whole idea of institutional racism. Let's listen to the clip, I Don't Know, Victor.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby has anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
I mean, you feel like he is sitting here today talking to us about that.
About America today.
Yes.
That's the tragedy. We're fortunate that his recordings still exist. But when he makes that statement, it's on the Dick Cavett show, and you can see the people who are sitting around him with their faces kind of
they're stunned.
Deer in the headlights, totally stunned. They didn't expect that, but he knew he knew how to use a bully pulpit
in order to get his point across.
Yes.
But what do you think, Karen, it says about the fact that that same bite is still so relevant today? I mean, Baldwin clearly could see into the future, like you said, but also what is it saying about our progress in terms of this country?
It's pretty sad. It's talking, that speech in particular, he's talking about institutionalized racism. Yes. He's talking about systemic racism. People try to talk about a post-racial America. Please, we aren't there. It may be that certain laws have been passed and then some of them unpassed. There's a certain amount of progress, but progress within people's minds when it still exists in the institution. The equal opportunities aren't out there. And we also need to acknowledge over the last, not just decades, but centuries, opportunities have been so curtailed by people on the low end of the spectrum that they haven't had the chance to build themselves to
be able to grow higher.
So we have a long way to go. However, there's also the personal issue, but there's a quote that really startled me when I was making the film when he says, as long as you insist on thinking you're white, I'm going to be forced to think I'm black. When I first heard him say that, I was stunned. Like the people on the Dick Cavett show, that hadn't crossed my mind. And I'm still working on that because we aren't to the place where I can stop thinking about the fact that there is a superficial difference between human beings.
Wow. That really, and I remember him saying that clip, or saying that in the film. And it struck me also that we both, on both sides, continue to, and then people talk about Another View as an example, where we say very specifically, we discuss today's issues from an African American perspective. But we do that purposely because we're trying to have everyone see a different perspective. And I think that we have to talk about our differences before we can come together as people.
I think James Baldwin would absolutely approve and agree, because the one thing that was necessary, that he believed was necessary, and this is why instead of writing, which he desperately wanted to do, as he put it, I couldn't sit in my ivory tower. I had to go out there and talk to people, get them talking, what you're doing. If we can start by just hearing other people's points of view, it's a screensaver on my computer right now, a James Baldwin quote. It's not in the film because he didn't say it on camera, but he said it in an interview. He said, if you can change, even by a millimeter, the way a person sees reality, then you can change reality. So it's one person at a time, one conversation at a time. It's a little bit slow. We need to move faster than that, but it does help to talk about it. That's what we're doing.
That's what we're doing, and that's why we're going to be at Fort Monroe Theater tomorrow afternoon from 2 until 5 p.m. And if you're just joining us, we're talking about the life and times of literary giant James Baldwin with filmmaker Karen Thorsen, her film, James Baldwin, The Price of a Ticket. Heather joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Heather. You're on the air.
Yes. Thank you, Barbara. And I love your guest and all of her personal information on this wonderful man. I certainly stand with him in his anger and rage for social justice. I am going to be rereading his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, this weekend. It is well compared to Cry the Beloved Country, and I would request that high school English teachers in Hampton Roads have Go Tell It on the Mountain as part of their curriculum. It is an extraordinary novel. It arrests, it disturbs. It's written with passion, drive, and utter reality, sensitive simplicity and directness. And it's about humanity. It's not about a divide. It is about humanity, which he was so, his insight is just beyond belief. And we're so welcoming for this film, and I hope people enjoy it tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the call, Heather. We appreciate it.
I just am excited to hear what you say, because we're working on a James Baldwin digital curriculum right now. And obviously, it will have, the whole goal is to have components that are available to download, and teachers can pick the pieces they want and create lesson plans out of the different components, and we're going to make that available nationwide. So you're talking about, yes, it should be in the English classes and the religion classes and the history classes and the civil rights and the ethics and the theater and the music. Jimmy casts a very wide reach. So he can be studied, and we're hoping that people use the curriculum to learn more about him.
Karen, what do we know about, or what do you know about Jimmy that we don't know? That's not in the film.
Oh.
That's but just as you're knowing him as a person, what is it, if there was one thing that you could say, you know what, even if you've never read Baldwin, even if you don't agree or disagree, you can agree or disagree with his point of view and so forth, but know this about the man?
Well, I hope some of it comes through in the film. It's difficult. If I've failed at this, then I've failed, because his warmth, his embrace, his making me feel as included as the next person, and his willingness to listen, even though he was this extraordinary talker. I think that one of his great gifts, and this doesn't come through in the film, is how much he was able to listen. Because, of course, you can't have him on camera listening so much.
Exactly.
But he had a huge embrace, a wonderful sense of humor, and a complicated personal life. And we couldn't get into all of that. But the love of his life is in the film. A young Swiss boy.
Is it the guy that is named as his personal assistant?
Yes.
I thought so.
No, not Bernard.
Oh.
No, well, he had several personal assistants. I told you it was complicated. No, his who was also his personal assistant, Lucien Happersberger, a young they met when Lucien, he were both in Paris when Jimmy was 24 and Lucien was 17.
Okay,
And
I remember him. Yeah,
that
'cause he talked
was
about it.
really the person he loved the most in his life, and at one point brought him to this country as his personal assistant just so they could spend some time together. But they weren't really together. I mean, Lucien went off and married females, and Jimmy nearly married a woman at some point. There were all kinds of complications. So just to say he had a wide embrace, that encompasses a lot.
So your film originally aired in the late 80s, and won all kinds of accolades, and it was a part of the PBS American Masters, and now it has been redigitized and brought to the 21st century, if you will. Talk to us a little bit about that process and what you're doing now with the Jimmy's Conversations.
Well, back in the day, back in the 80s, it sounds, archaic, but we shot
know,
on
that's
16
terrible.
millimeter film, that stuff that you see here going through film projectors. Anyway, and it's also something that can deteriorate. I used to think it was silent films that were falling apart, and they are, but what happened is Martin Scorsese was making a film for HBO, and he on Fran Lebowitz, the writer and public speaker, and her idol was James Baldwin. And so he said, I want some footage from your film, please, Karen and Doug, because I know your film and we want to include it in our HBO documentary on Fran. And so we offered him a video master. He said, no, I know you shot on 16. I want get the negative up from the lab. And that's when we discovered it was actually decomposing. And he said, if you don't save it, it's going to be lost. And so with the help, as I said, the Ford Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, Stan and Joanne Martyr, these people who cared enough about James Baldwin to want to preserve the film. And it now is, instead of an old square image, it's letterbox, it's gorgeous, it's HD, and it's all digital, which means that's how we can do a digital curriculum, because we can take pieces of the film. And it's a wonderful evolution. But back to Fran Lebowitz, the film that Scorsese was doing, she discovered Baldwin. How does this, she's white, she's Jewish, she's gay. Okay, what is it? Well, she was 15 years old in New Jersey, and she suddenly found a book by James Baldwin, and he spoke to her, and she read all of his work, and it became her hero. So that it just shows what a wide embrace.
Absolutely.
Again.
So what's your favorite Baldwin novel?
Oh, golly.
Novel first before we do the.
I think it was Heather who called in. She had a great list, but anyone I read, I just am sort of knocked back because I can't believe I'm reading this in 2017 or whenever, and how accurately appropriate it is. I love the fact that he was able to take risks as a writer, that he wrote Giovanni's Room, which is about homosexuality and the difficulty of homosexual love, about a white American Protestant lad in Paris. He wasn't writing about himself except in the deepest emotional sense. He wasn't writing about race. He wrote about in Beale Street. We talked about that book. He writes in the first person of a 19-year-old pregnant black female. Now that's a leap.
Exactly, that is a real leap. And were you surprised at the reviews and how they really? I mean, they panned him.
Well, yeah, but he was also ahead of the curve. If you read Beale Street now, I think any high school kid who would read that today would find something absolutely to relate to if they have any consciousness. Because here, this young girl, 19-year-old. Her fiance, whom she's set to marry, is arrested unjustly, goes to prison. It's all about mass incarceration and what happens to the fabric of a community. It is so current.
Wow. But I'm curious why it made the critics so angry.
I don't know, because I think it's right on the nose. I think they weren't ready for him. I think some of his writing was ahead of the curve, and we're just taking our sweet time to get there.
Yeah. What did he talk about with you in terms of why he found it so important to go overseas? As he started to write, because he needed to kind of get away from it in order to look back on it.
It wasn't just about getting away. What he was afraid of, he was going to lose the core value that his mother had given him, the importance of loving another human being of whatever race or religion or color. He was afraid that he would hurt someone or be killed. It comes down to that. He had been beaten up. He'd been he'd had encounters. He had the urge to strike back. He knew that he was capable of hurting another human being, and he didn't believe in that morally or philosophically. But he knew that if he might need to defend himself, or he might just get so angry. Here we are back to not bitterness, but justified anger. Yeah. And so he left the country really to save his life.
You know, it's interesting because a lot of times I've had people say to me, well, do you face discrimination more because you're African American or because you're a woman? And so my question to you is, for Baldwin, was it because he was African American or because he was gay, in terms of the things that he had to fight against? What do you think?
He certainly had to fight against both. Initially, I think it was being African American, because that's what you see on first glance. You don't wear the sign, oh, by the way, I'm gay, but you can get that message. But I'd say very indicative to the discrimination he suffered while he was a known homosexual. For example, the March on Washington. He was, with Bayard Rustin, one of the key people. He was supposed to be up on the podium. And they put him in the front row. And the word is both he and Bayard were not asked to speak because, it wasn't sure what they would say. It was a little risky to put them up there. But also, they were representing something that I think the movement was just a little too scared to add one more ingredient. In any case, they were excluded.
Oh. Good gracious. But he was there. And
he was there.
And he and Martin Luther King were good friends.
They were. And he and Malcolm X were good friends. And what's interesting is Malcolm X and Jimmy were often opposed. And they were actually put on radio shows like this where, isn't this good? We'll have two guys on the opposite sides of the fence. Let's have them talk at each other. And so they would satisfy by, giving the audience a certain dynamic, and then after that they'd be arms around each other, and you could hear the outtakes, and they were just laughing about it. But what they were doing, as I think Jimmy once said, maybe it takes a Malcolm to drive people into the arms of Martin.
Ah, yeah. So and he truly believed that everybody had something to contribute.
Yes, he did.
To society.
And he was good at finding that. That was the listening part. He really did. He cared about people. He helped so many people in his lifetime. He wasn't just about, it's about me.
I love the interviews with Maya Angelou.
Oh.
As she talked about him. I mean, I think this whole, how writers respect each other, and respect each other's work and understand each other.
Well, be still my heart. Maya Angelou is somebody I admire. I'll give you two Maya stories.
Sure.
One is, I'm a little ashamed to say, when we first had her, she was coming to New York to do some public speaking, and so it seemed like a good time to film her for our film, and she had agreed to do it. So she was staying in a hotel, and we filmed her in the room. And as I came into the room, and I just read it, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and my head was just full of her presence and her eloquence, and I walked in. Oh, Maya, I'm so honored to meet you. She said, my dear, I would ask you please to address me as Dr. Angelo. Oh. I worked very hard for that title. And whoa! Oh. I was so embarrassed. I thought, have I blown this entire thing? She may not do the interview. Well, not in the least. She was totally there for us. It was just she told me what respect she expected to get. And wow. And then I found out that even her niece and nephew would call her doctor. So I felt a little better.
What a great story. What a great story.
Another story. It's just near the end, long after Jimmy was gone. They were such close friends. They were literally brother and sister. When Jimmy brought Dr. Angelo, shame on me, Dr. Angelo home to meet his mother, he said, I know you don't need another daughter, but here she is. And Jimmy encouraged Maya to write her first book, and they edited each other. When Maya was really near the last 6 months of her life, we told her that we wanted to do an hour-long version of our film for high school students, and that her voice was the most distinctive in the film, and we knew we could bridge some of the gaps that when you cut a 90-minute film down to 60, it leaves some... It needs bridges, and her voice was ideal. She agreed to do it, and she literally did the recording. She was on an oxygen tank. She would take a deep breath, take the instrument out of her nostrils, and read the line and put it back. And she did that. We did a 2-day session with her, and she did. It was her gift to her brother Jimmy. Just amazing. What a woman.
What a story. That's incredible. So you have his brother in the film,
David.
You have others who loved him and who were about him. Talk to me about David and his relationship with Jimmy.
David and Jimmy were so close, and stepbrothers, but that's never been an issue. That was the part of where Jimmy always called his stepfather his father. It's difficult to be a famous person with siblings who aren't as famous as you are. Imagine that dynamic in a family. Exactly. But he and David just were kindred spirits, and they often traveled together, lived together, and admired each other. And David was really this central connection for us after Jimmy died. He spoke to the family and said, look, Karen and Jimmy were working together, and we had already been in communication, so he knew about the project. That was why we were allowed to film the funeral. The family had said no one can film at the funeral. It was thanks to David's saying, no, Jimmy would have wanted this.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. So, Karen, you have a story within yourself because you started out as a journalist.
I did. Yes, I did.
How did you make the bridge from journalism? And you also were the editor for Simon & Schuster? Is that right?
I always wanted to be a writer, and that's why Jimmy and his writings first spoke to me. But then, I was an editor at Simon & Schuster. I was then a reporter and editor at Life magazine, and then when Life folded, I was a foreign correspondent for Time in Paris. I got to do journalism, but I had just the more I went to the movies, the more I was seduced. And I realized, okay, you still get to be a writer when you're a filmmaker, but you also get to play with a lot of other toys. And so I ended up getting into film, and I found it really, the opportunities aren't always there for women. I found it really hard to break into film and fiction.
Really?
Oh,
what happened? Tell us about that a little bit.
I wanted to be a screenwriter and a filmmaker, and thought, okay, I could direct a film. I think that's within reach. And then I went to Hollywood and found out how hard it was, and I actually wrote a screenplay that got optioned, and I thought, well, that wasn't so hard. But then it got optioned another year, still wasn't made. Well, that was a little harder. And then the producer died who had optioned it, and that was the end of that. And then it was like, okay, maybe if you have big hair, you can be head of a studio kind of.
Well, now I got to ask you, because since you've been in the business for so long, did you run into the same type of Harvey Weinstein issue?
Actually, it has made me. I've debated whether I should put up a hashtag #MeToo story. Yes, there were stories. It's unfortunate, but the gentleman, shall we say, sent me 2 dozen roses the next morning, and I came out unscathed. But
Gotcha.
It was he. It was another instance of someone who thought he couldn't resist, and then thank goodness he did.
Good gracious.
But there was the in-between part that wasn't so pretty.
It wasn't so nice.
But yeah, that's out there, and it's whatever color you are. I think it's harder to break into Hollywood. Look, we go back to Oscars So White in 2016, and this discussion is still ongoing. They're trying to expand the members of the Academy to include more African Americans and more women. So it's an issue for all of us.
For all of us across the board. So do you think, now you've made other films. This is not your one and done.
But I was working actually on a film on Thomas Paine. I love history and I love game changers. And Thomas Paine was the guy who wrote Common Sense and got everybody to join the revolution back in 1770s. But my husband and I worked together very often, and we stopped that project because the restoration of the Baldwin film suddenly came up, and that was right at the moment. We got the film restored. It costs a lot of money to get a film restored. It was a privilege to be able to do that. But then, okay, what do you do with it? Sure, it can go back on PBS, but we wanted to get conversations going, and it was right when Trayvon Martin was killed. And so we came up with this thing called Conversations with Jimmy, which is the same as Race. Let's talk about it. And we've been doing it all over the country.
So what have you been hearing from Conversations with Jimmy? What are people talking about?
Well, that we aren't there yet, that progress is too slow and change is necessary. But what I find is that the more people talk, the more, sometimes people are in tears when they talk about their experience. There was one woman who we had a screening at, this one was at Yale University, and the woman said, well, I came up from Haiti. When I came, I was pregnant, and I had a son, and I thought, I have a son in America. And then she said, my next thought was, I have a son in America, and it's all about the talk. And will he survive? And will I be able to raise him? Imagine a mother who is rejoicing at the same time about being able to leave a bad situation, come to a country, and then have to fear for the life of her newly born child. So we're there, and we're talking about it.
Do you find that in your conversations, because it's interesting what happens as the conversations we've been having throughout Hampton Roads, is there a difference between different races in the group in terms of perspective, or are people pretty much on the same page who come to this?
Well, what we do, we try and have a community co-hosts, and each of them with a slightly different constituency, and so their email list, if the people choose to come, it's a diverse group, so that means different economic situations, and it's not just about race, and we try to get a mixed community of all kinds. And when we go into a high school, a lot of times if we're working in an inner city, okay, you have a somewhat of a
homogenous group.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends where you are, but we try to get people to think about, do you know someone who matters to your family who's gone to prison? Do you know someone of a different religion? Do you have relations with someone who has a different gender preference? And get them thinking about that, and get them to come a little closer and find out what they have in common. The divide is not yet bridged, but...
But do you feel like it's getting closer?
Well, at the end of every audience, there's... people are hugging each other. So there's that, and then there are always people who still have a way to go.
I heard yesterday on NPR that the StoryCorps folks are starting a new project where they are going to put strangers of different political perspectives into the StoryCorps booth. And they're calling it, I think it's something like One Step at a Time, or something to that, along that sentiment. And I thought, this is really interesting because most of the StoryCorps pieces are of people who know each other, and they're sharing a story
and I've
or a
listened
conversation.
to them. They have often brought me to tears.
Right, exactly. So, but now they really want to try to say, okay, you and I, if we didn't know each other prior to our interview today, or whomever, but two people who have different political perspectives to come in
kind of
together.
like your round table.
Kind of like my round table, absolutely.
I mean, I imagine the sparks do fly upon occasion.
Yeah, just a little.
I mean, and sometimes you don't find common ground, but sometimes, usually, there's some glimmer. Yeah. There's you get that, what Jimmy called the millimeter, even a millimeter. If you can get that millimeter, then you can get another.
Exactly. And that's why I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think we live in silos. We all have our ivory towers and our places where we don't interact enough with difference. And so if it can begin at an early age, education is the center of it all. If you can begin helping kids understand how to bridge those differences, they do better as adults, and they'll bring it to their voting habits, and they'll bring it to their legislation support.
Here's a dilemma I think about all the time. I have an 8-year-old granddaughter. Now, from when she was small, toddler, and all the kids in the neighborhood come together, black, white, pink, purple, doesn't matter. Everybody's playing together. And then once they hit a certain age, then all of a sudden race becomes a difference. And it's pointed out. So I guess my question is, how do we get, because that's got to come from taught behavior, not from some gene that just all of a sudden appears and you recognize the difference. So how do we get people to stop teaching our young people to be hateful, but to be together?
One of the things that we have as a component of our curriculum, which is a work in progress, and so this part isn't created yet, but I know the portions of it already exist. It's sort of a social identity workshop. It's more physical than written. It's about interactions and a certain amount of role playing and game playing, and it helps the kids. And again, if you can start with the young people, the curriculum also has a section for teachers and for students, and so there aren't enough African American teachers out there.
That's
and so there are a fair amount of white teachers who need perhaps someone to help them figure out, how do I address this in my classroom? So we try and offer some, and we're working with scholars, we're working with teachers who are actually doing this already. So they're helping us
that is great.
Provide the tools. So we hope that'll help.
So are Jimmy's conversations still continuing? Are you still going around the country?
Absolutely. Well, part of this event is happening because the National Endowment for the Arts came to us a little over a year ago and said, well, the National Park Service is having a centennial, and they've done a study, and they find that what is missing, the national parks are enormously important and successful and almost too crowded, but they don't have as much of a relationship as they would like with surrounding communities or with young people of color. And so they said, we would like to do an initiative where you bring the James Baldwin film to national parks because they have these great auditoriums and they want to reach out to the community. So can you make a project work? So we, our first one, we launched it this spring. Our first one was at the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park in New Orleans. And we had a whole week long of screenings, but before each film screening, we had a half an hour of jazz and blues played by local musicians.
Oh, wow.
And then after the screening, the conversation that we would have, again, this conversation with Jimmy, let's talk about race, was the musicians would join us. And they came into the audience with the park rangers. And
that's awesome.
The conversation was amazing. And again, some people come to tears
and that's why we're bringing...
few people walk out.
and that's what we're hoping for tomorrow, that we make sure that we have people stay after the film. And really, I want to tell you all now, if you're planning to come to the film, do not get up when the credits start. You need to see it all the way to the very end, and I'm not going to tell you why, but you just need to sit there and watch it to the very end. But the National Park Service, Fort Monroe, it's all coming together so that we can have this conversation here. And,
I couldn't be more thrilled. This began with PBS back in the 1980s. They were on board with the first film that we were going to do with Jimmy, the one called Remember This House.
Oh.
And then when he died, it became this, and Jimmy's still with us.
So we got about a minute left. What if someone has never read Baldwin, where would you tell them to start?
If they like nonfiction, The Fire Next Time, and even high school kids, it's like 6 pages, the opening essay, and it's the letter to my nephew. It's called My Dungeon Shook, a letter to my nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Long title, but basically it started as Jimmy writing a letter to his nephew. How do you cope in this America?
Wow.
Back in 1963. It still applies in 2017. Read that. And if you like fiction, I'd say read the short story Sonny's Blues. It's in the collection of Going to Meet the Man. It's a great story about 2 brothers, and it says it all.
Karen Thorsen, what a pleasure it has been to talk with you today, and I look forward to our continuing this conversation tomorrow at Fort Monroe.
Can't wait.
Thank you so very much for joining us. We so appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for listening to us today. We do hope to see you tomorrow for the screening and the talk back at Fort Monroe Theater, and then again at Virginia Wesleyan University next Saturday for our conversation about Muslims and the Islamic faith. And to find out about more for each of these events, please visit whro.org/talkaboutrace. Tomorrow's event is from 2 until 5 p.m. at the Fort Monroe Theater at Fort Monroe in Hampton. Please go to whro.org/talkaboutrace. Sign up. There's plenty of time. And if you forget to sign up, come anyway. We'd love to have you. Next week, a deeper understanding of Muslims and the Islamic faith. My guest is Ms. Seher Mizra. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Victor Bowen is our audio engineer, and Catherine Fink answered our phones. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Thank you so very, very much for listening to Another View.